The Hard Rock Vault in Orlando, Florida houses 17,000 square feet of rock and roll artifacts, images, and memorabilia. Everything from Buddy Holly's glasses to John Lennon's Rickenbacker guitar. Hi, I'm Ray Manzarek of The Doors. You know, there are some rock and roll treasures that even a building this size can't hold. I'm talking about the studios. I'm talking about the clubs, the theaters, where rock history was made. Now, in the next 2 hours, we're going to travel to some of the world's most important rock and roll and soul landmarks and see and hear from the artists whose music helped make them famous. So come on with us and discover what made these otherwise ordinary places into the temples of rock.
Sun Records was the genius of Sam Phillips.
Everybody who was anybody came into the Whisky and partied.
Some of the drummers were trying to play jazz, and I said, no, rock and roll.
People were just on the ground screwing everywhere, you know what I mean? They were just making love.
CBGB is just a dumpy little bar, but you know, we have television, we have Patti Smith, we have the Ramones.
Fillmore East to rock and roll was like Carnegie Hall. I mean, it was the World Series.
You don't realize that you're not just making music, you're making history.
Beale Street in Memphis is recognized as the home of the blues, and many consider Memphis to be the birthplace of rock and roll. When rock music was born, it was played loud, fast, and with an attitude. Since then, it's undergone many styles, but none of them may have ever happened if it wasn't for the studio on the corner of Union and Marshall and the late-night sessions played there by men searching for their musical souls.
Sun Studio to me is kind of like Gettysburg, you know, less bloody, but when you're at Gettysburg, and Gettysburg is like, you know, haunted, and I'm not a big guy for ghosts and goblins, but Gettysburg's haunted, and there's certain places in the world, in America, that are just haunted. The spirits are there, and Sun Studios is one of those.
Entering Sun Studios is like entering hallowed ground. It's the place where Howlin' Wolf, Johnny Cash, Carl Perkins, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Elvis Presley made their first recordings. The pioneers of modern rock music. Today, Sun Studios stands as the only recording studio in America to be designated a historic landmark, attracting visitors from around the world to see the treasures and hear the legends.
King of rock and roll, Elvis Presley standing right here. Without that little room, a whole genre of music would never been born. That room is it. That's holy grail. That is the spot. And when they walk in there and when they leave, it's two different things. They go in going, this is it, this is it. They leave going, oh my God, that's it.
Sun Studio has also changed people's lives, like that of tour guide Johnny Sun.
I'm from Philadelphia. I moved 1,013 miles just to be here at Sun. It's just the only reason why I came to Memphis was to work here. This is exactly what happened. You're standing on the same floor, and it's just the energy of the room, the vibe, everything is just still alive in there.
Also migrating to Memphis were the musical influences that helped develop rock and roll at Sun Studio. Rolling in over the Arkansas plains was the sound of Western swing. Riding up from Mississippi came gospel and the blues. And from the east, you could hear the twangs of the Grand Ole Opry. With blues and country music mixing in the Memphis air, a young recording engineer set up shop at 706 Union Avenue. There he worked and he waited until one day a new sound called rock and roll was delivered right to his front door. That young engineer's name was Sam Phillips, and his story is the story of Sun.
Sun Records was the genius of Sam Phillips. There's no doubt about it.
Well, Sam Phillips just had this ear for music that made things happen that wouldn't have happened otherwise.
Sam Phillips, you know, was like this enlightened capitalist visionary. you know, because he wasn't there, you know, he wasn't getting a government grant to do this, you know. Sam Phillips wanted to make some money, right? But he wanted to make money on his own terms.
A genius. Changed the face of music forever.
In 1950, Sam Phillips took a 10-year lease on the small building at 706 Union. There he opened the Memphis Recording Service. Their motto, we record anything, anytime, anywhere. Sam offered his services to the public, making records of their voices or recording their special occasions. His real passion was recording local blues artists like Howlin' Wolf, Rufus Thomas, and a young B.B. King. Initially, he would sell these recordings to other record companies, but within a year, he would press them on his own label, which he called Sun Records. Sam knew, however, to make a real impact in the music business, he'd have to come up with something new.
What Sam wanted was to be able to find a white man, an appealing white man, that could sing like a black man.
Sam's wish walked into his front office on a hot July afternoon. Though he wasn't there, his assistant, Marion Kiesker, was. She greeted the young man who stood in front of her holding an old guitar. The young man asked if he could make a record for his mama. Marion asked him for his name, and he replied, "Ma'am, my name is Elvis." She made the recording and was so impressed with his voice that she kept a tape to play for Sam Phillips. Then Sam agreed to a formal audition with Elvis, backed by guitarist Scotty Moore and bassist Bill Black.
We'll set the scene up for July 5th of 1954. 19 years old at this point, folks. Elvis Presley standing right here on the Sex. Sam Phillips will be more comfortable relaxing for Elvis, not to watch him recording, but to watch his band, so that's why he's standing right here. On that X right there was Scotty Moore playing electric guitar.
We went in the studio on Monday night, and I might think of a song. Do you know that? We'd try it. Sam would suggest something. Bill would suggest something.
Sam recorded reams of tape that night. And Elvis was trying to be Dean Martin, you know, which was one of his favorite singers. He was trying to be a loungy act type of thing, and it wasn't turning Sam on at all.
We took a break just prior, really, to packing up and going home, and he started just beating the fire of his guitar, singing "That's All Right, Mama."
Sam came out to this door and said, "Man, that's the sound I'm looking for." Told his guys to run through it, want to make a test copy, play it on the radio before we actually got the records pressed.
Well, that's all right, Mama. That's all right for you. That's all right, Mama.
I heard it the next morning, and by the end of the day, Elvis had taken Memphis.
That was so totally new. That song, "That's All Right, Mama," that beat, that popping beat, and that just jumping sound, that was not something that was going on.
Well, the instrumentation was totally different. You know, it wasn't slick, didn't have drums, but it was rock and roll.
Elvis Presley continued to record hits on Sun, making him a rising sensation in the South. News of this young man and his new style of music reached RCA Records in the North. They could envision the national sensation that Elvis would become. So RCA traveled to Memphis, determined to buy his contract from Sam Phillips.
They made him an offer he couldn't refuse, and he didn't have the money to put the records out nationwide.
Sam Phillips at that point was on the verge of bankruptcy. Guys, most likely if Elvis would have stayed here, his career, along with Sun Records, probably would have died together. Selling that contract was a very important, very wise business decision for Sam Phillips. Most importantly, all those other guys recording after Elvis could now come and record, Sun could stay open.
Although Elvis stayed at Sun for only 17 months, the records that he made there traveled across radio waves like a beacon, calling out to other young men in the South who had similar music burning in their souls. Men like Johnny Cash, Carl Perkins, and Jerry Lee Lewis. Next, we'll see how they and other artists helped make Sun Studio into a temple of rock.
We're back with Travel Channel Presents.
Hi, I'm Ray Manzarek of The Doors. Welcome back to the Temples of Rock. Sun Studio in Memphis is a lot more than just the place where Sam Phillips first recorded Elvis Presley. It's where some of the most important rock records were made.
Studio today offers guided tours of their historic site by day while continuing to be a functioning recording studio at night. What was once an adjacent luncheonette is now the waiting room for visitors to the studio tour.
You guys are standing on the original floor. It's original acoustical tiles on the walls. It's original acoustic baffling up there on the ceiling.
Sun's rich history has not only drawn tourists, it's attracted many rock celebrities as well.
I went there in the late 70s. It was closed. It had been closed for a number of years, but this one kid had the job of taking care of it. We were playing a CSN in the 70s in Memphis. He calls us up at the hotel and he says, listen, I don't want to bother you, but, you know, I kind of take care of this place called Sun Records. I'm right there. We were some of the first people in there for years and years and years, and I'm just awestruck. The kid says to me, he says, hey, do you want one of the ceiling tiles? And I went, wow, because I just read a scientific theory that sound that's going on gets painted. If you're painting the ceiling and you're talking, that the sound waves get trapped in the paint. It was a kind of a wild theory, but it was exciting to me. So he goes, okay, well that area that we're putting in 1963, so that's not the area. Oh, there's the 1953 to 1957 area. And he goes up and he takes one down for me, and I still have it to this day.
The unusual acoustic tile ceiling of Sun Studio is one of the many innovations that Sam Phillips designed to make his recordings special. He also introduced the use of tape delay echo to make just a few musicians sound like many. And he pioneered the art of studio mic placement at a time when there were no separate takes or overdubs. But perhaps the biggest reason for the success of Sun was Sam's willingness to keep his studio doors open to all newcomers wanting to give rock and roll a try. One of the first of these was a country picker named Johnny Cash.
When he first walked through that front door, Johnny Cash was an unknown traveling salesman. He was leaning up against the door when Sam Phillips came in the morning. He said, Mr. Phillips, if you hear me, I promise you, you will not be disappointed. The most consistent artist here was Johnny Cash, and the most hits on Sun Records.
But he was hooked up with what was considered at the time one of the worst bands ever. God bless him, Luther Perkins could barely play the guitar at all. But Sam thought it was worth it because he liked that and it was a signature. Ding 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 boom tick ding tick ding tick. That was all he could play. Ding tick ding tick ding tick ding tick ding. And he would screw that up over and over and over again until Johnny would come in like apologize for him, and Sam was going, no, it's worth it, trust me, it's worth it.
He saw something in distorted guitars, in less than perfect technical performances. That was where the magic was. And he stuck to his guns pretty much at Sun.
Carl Perkins was another Sun pioneer who was short on craft and long on talent.
Folks, 3 o'clock in the morning, on the back of a paper bag, Carl Perkins wrote the song Blue Suede Shoes. From Jackson, Tennessee, he's the king of rockabilly. He's one of the greatest artists of all time. Carl Perkins, standing right there, December 17th of '55, recording this song right here.
Well, it's 1 for the money, 2 for the show.
See, that's really musical incorrect, because it's 1 for the money, 2 for the show. Now, see, if we'd have known really the correct way to play, it'd have been 1 for the money, 2 for the show. See, but we didn't know. And if I'd have known exactly what I was doing, I wouldn't have made that mistake, and the record wouldn't have been as good.
Well, it's 1 for the money, 2 for the show, 3 to get ready. Now go, cat, go, but don't step on my blue suede shoe. Well, you can do anything but lay off my blue suede shoe.
A short time later, Jerry Lee Lewis would become a big star. He would have 2 of the biggest hits that would ever be released on the Sun record label, #1 and #2.
A young Jerry Lee Lewis rose up from Louisiana and tore into Sun Studio like a tornado. Brash and confident, he demanded an audition with Sam Phillips. Sam wasn't there, but recording engineer Jack Clement was.
He played a version of the old Gene Autry song, You're the Only Star in My Blue Heaven. Remember that? You're the only star in my blue heaven. It was a waltz. Good old Jerry Lee sits down at the piano and goes, Bum, 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 you're the only star in my blue heaven. Hey, I like that. When Sam came back from Nashville the following Monday, I put the tape on, started playing. Before it ever got to the voice, he reached on and stopped it. He said, now I can sell that.
It's just great balls of fire.
Sam Phillips devoted nearly all his time and energy to promoting his hot new star. It paid off with hits like A Whole Lot of Shakin' Going On and Great Balls of Fire. But Sam's devotion to Jerry Lee undermined the rest of the Sun stable. A disgruntled Johnny Cash moved to Columbia Records and pursued a country music career. Carl Perkins survived a near-fatal car crash, but his career didn't. As for Jerry Lee Lewis, when the news broke of his marriage to his 13-year-old cousin, it stopped his rock career cold. Sam himself was growing weary of Sun Records, and when the lease was up in 1960, he decided to leave 706 Union. He moved his recording service elsewhere and left the magical studio behind. For years, the studio remained practically untouched. But in 1985, it was reopened as a recording studio once again. A new generation of rock stars was eager to taste the legendary magic of Sun Studio.
Folks, in 1987, the Irish rock group U2 was here. In this room, U2 recorded 3 tracks for Ride On Hum, recorded Love Rescue Me, Angel of Harlem, When Love Comes to Town with B.B. King. Ringo Starr's been here, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, Def Leppard, Henry Rollins, the Stray Cats, Matchbox 20, Billy Bob Thornton, Dennis Quaid, Beck, Billy Swan, Johnny Sun.
The man who opened the door to rock and roll, Sam Phillips, died in 2003. But the studio he built and the legacy he left has inspired generations of musicians to search for their musical souls.
I got the keys. I'm the manager of Sun Studio, and I come in here at 2 o'clock in the morning. Always, I'm writing songs in there and just feeling the vibe in there.
Long after the last tourist has left the building, Johnny Sun and his Memphis Maulers set up to play in the revered Sun Studio. Their music is loud, fast, and played with an attitude, much like the sounds that made this rock temple famous. For Johnny Sun, his hope is that someday his spirit might mingle with those that haunt the legendary studio called Sun. Next, we'll travel to Liverpool, England, and see how the sounds made in Memphis helped build a British temple of rock.
Musically, when Elvis came out, I was the teenager then, and I just heard rock and roll.
We're back with Travel Channel Presents.
There are rumors around that this is Britain's revenge for the Boston Tea Party. 3,000 screaming teenagers are at New York's Kennedy Airport to greet, you guessed it, the Beatles.
Before the Beatles became a worldwide pop phenomenon, they were only one part of a revolution brewing in the port town of Liverpool, England. Young musicians there absorbed the sounds coming from America and were about to embark on an invasion that would change the world of music. The headquarters for this operation was a small, dark, subterranean club called the Cavern.
The Cavern was an old fruit warehouse right in the centre of Liverpool.
When channeled through these 3 narrow brick tunnels which constitutes the Cavern at the time, the sound was phenomenal.
One way in, a narrow staircase, only one way out. A disaster waiting to happen.
The atmosphere, the sheer heat, the sheer smell actually, all contributed to this legendary Cavern ambience.
Lots of frenzy, lots of screaming girls, lots of high energy rock and roll, lots of sweat.
Water used to just run down the walls, which was just, condensation after people sweating,
Sorry to put it like this, but there was a lot of body odour down there, mixed with the smell of bleach, because they bleached the place religiously every morning.
It was a dirty little stinky hole, but we loved it, because the people who were down there were great people. The kids loved it. It was a party.
Unbelievable, funky, great times at the Cavern. It was very, very special.
The crowds that suffered through the conditions at the Cavern were rewarded with witnessing the birth of a temple of rock. If you travel to Matthew Street in Liverpool today, you'll be rewarded with a modern-day Cavern Club, offering music day and night. By visiting Liverpool, you'll realize how its welcoming ways helped nurture the sound that shook the world. Set on the banks of the Mersey River, it was the first stop for new music and culture traveling across the Atlantic in the late 50s.
Musically, when Elvis came out, and coming from Liverpool, all the rock records that all the guys in the Navy were bringing in.
Life goes on day after day. Any seaport has more music than anywhere else, so we started playing music from all over the world.
So ferry, cross the Mersey, cause this land...
But before these new sounds arrived in England, the Cavern had firmly established itself as a jazz cellar. Open since 1957, the Cavern had little use for an upstart new beat.
Used to have fights in Liverpool with bands because some of the drummers were trying to play jazz, and I said, no, rock and roll.
It wasn't licensed at all, the Cavern. You could only buy Coca-Cola or tea and coffee, and so the jazzers used to go to the pub. We used to play in between the jazz bands going for a drink.
Once rock and roll was played on the stage of the Cavern, there was no looking back. The Cavern's lack of a liquor license made it perfect for a teenage hangout. It soon became a mecca for young Liverpudlians looking to dig a new rockin' sound. And the young bands playing there weren't content with just imitating American records.
And bands like ourselves, and especially the Beatles, were probably the first bands to come out where they had 3 lead singers. They did vocal harmony songs as well as playing other musicians themselves, so they were completely self-contained, which made them different to everything else that was happening in the world, really.
All of a sudden, rock and roll became very real, very simple, very energetic, very primitive in a way.
One of the most popular bands to play the Cavern was, of course, the Beatles. But they weren't exactly the same band that would shake up the world of music only a few years later.
By the time the Beatles became regulars at the Cavern, they did comprise of John and Paul McCartney and George Harrison of the subsequently legendary lineup. But the Beatles had long had problems attracting a drummer. It was because they were called upon to fulfill some bookings in Hamburg that they needed a drummer at short notice, and that was how they acquired Pete Best, another local boy.
There was Pete, who was this good-looking guy, and Bob Buller, the DJ, would say, can I hear it one more time for John, George, Paul. And when Pete used to walk on the stage, the kids just mobbed the stage, man.
He was the most popular in the band. People in those days, before the Beatles made it outside of Liverpool, used to camp out and sleep in his garden.
First time I saw the Beatles, the thing that hit me besides the great vocals and the great musicianship was Pete Best's bass drum. It just thundered in the Cavern.
The Beatles' sound attracted many newcomers to the Cavern, including the man who would change their lives forever, manager Brian Epstein.
Now, Brian Epstein was working literally a couple of hundred yards away from the place where the Beatles were playing every day, and Brian was in charge of the one of the larger record stores in the city.
Brian Epstein went down them steps into the Cavern, which wasn't the most pleasant place in the world, and saw the Beatles on the stage, and brought the Beatles from there to the top of their game.
Brian Epstein is credited with discovering the Beatles at the Cavern, but it remains a mystery as to who and what made them change their lineup just before they made it big.
We went to Brian's office one day, Brian Epstein's office. He asked to see us. So we got the lift up there, and as we opened the lift, Pete Best was walking out of Brian's office. And we said, all right, Pete, how you doing? And he just looked at us blankly, got on the lift and went down. And then Brian's secretary came out and said, Tony, Billy, I'm sorry, Brian can't see you at the moment. He will explain later. Right? And we didn't find out for another couple of days that Pete had just been sacked, literally minutes before we went up.
And when news of Pete's sacking reached the fans at the Cavern, there was an uproar of protest.
The crowd were pissed off. Because Peter was a good-looking lad.
And such was the degree of hostility that entering the Cavern that night, George Harrison was attacked.
We were there actually at the Cavern when Ringo's first show.
But George didn't play because he had a black eye.
Somehow they picked on George, said it must be your fault, so somebody punched him.
George got the punch, yeah.
And in some of the Beatles' very earliest publicity shots taken at the time that they began their recording career, you can actually still see the remnants of a black eye on George Harrison's features.
I don't think it came up to the drumming ability. I think it was the look.
It took a long time for them to accept Ringo. In fact, they never really accepted Ringo, not people in Liverpool. It was only when it went worldwide that, okay, he then became a Beatle.
The Beatles left Liverpool and the Cavern in 1963. They were whisked off on a flight to stardom that they never could have imagined. But for all their worldly success, it just may be that their best performances were left behind at the Cavern.
I believe the best I ever heard the Beatles, and I did a lot of shows with them, was at the Cavern. There was nobody screaming and nobody going crazy, and you could really appreciate what they were all about.
The Cavern continued on without the Beatles, featuring many of the best bands Britain had to offer. But in 1973, plans for a new underground railway ran right through the Cavern, and the buildings on top of it were demolished, closing the original site forever. Spurred by John Lennon's death in 1980, Liverpool regained interest in their favorite sons and opened the new Cavern Club in 1984. Built adjacent to the original, it used original Cavern bricks for its arches and its stairwells. Once underground, it's very much like it was in the 60s, except now they serve beer as well. Audiences travel the world over to see this temple of rock. And bands like this one from Argentina are thrilled to have the chance to play on its stage. Visiting the Cavern today is like taking a trip back in time.
It's actually been open longer than its predecessor. So we now face the same problems. The smells are coming back, and you should come in some mornings. It's something else.
One new addition is a larger side stage for headlining musicians. That's where Paul McCartney returned to play a historic Millennium concert. His stamp of approval certified this new space as a true rock temple. And what of the other Cavern alumni? Though none of them matched the Beatles' runaway success, they continued to make music and can still rock a hometown crowd. They can be satisfied in their contribution to changing the sound of rock and roll and in helping lay the foundation of one of the world's most famous temples of rock. Coming up, we'll travel to New York's temple of punk rock, CBGB.
Blondie was just a lightweight pop band, and no one really cared about them at all.
We're back with Travel Channel Presents.
Rock and roll started in back alleys and small clubs, but by the mid-70s, top rock acts were filling stadiums and arenas. And their music? Well, it was often overshadowed by spinning drum sets, never-ending bass solos, and outrageous costumes. Meanwhile, young unknown bands were looking to capture rock's early arrogance and energy. All they needed was a place to play.
That place was located in New York City, a club with the mysterious name of CBGB. We'll find out what that means later. But first, let's hear what made this downtown temple famous.
Well, it's kind of like an icon. It hasn't changed since I've been 13, especially like bathrooms.
This is where it all started, the whole punk scene, and it's just so many rock bands started out their careers here. It's just, you know, rock history right here, just in this building.
CBGBs to me represents a certain quality of music that's just, you know, timeless.
Well, it may be too soon to tell if the music now played at CBGB will one day be called timeless. But back in the 70s, the music played on this stage was also considered radical and different.
I don't
mom and dad. Don't need no pretty face. Don't need no human race. I got some news for you. Don't even need to do. I got my time machine. Got my electronic dream. Sonic producer and a loser. Sonic producer and a loser.
There was no clubs to play original material. Clubs were basically for cover bands.
CBGB's was one of the only places in town where a band could play original music. In fact, where the owner insisted that I want you to play original music.
I made it a policy, the only way they could play CBGB's, they had to do their own music. And once that word got out, everybody started to come.
The name of this band is Talking Heads.
The stage at CBGB launched the careers of Talking Heads, Blondie, the Ramones, and many others. It showcased diverse approaches to rock and roll, and it's considered the birthplace of punk rock. This dark space that became such an important temple of rock was originally a seedy flophouse bar. In 1973, Hilly Kristal, a former jazz club manager, decided to take over the space and turn it into a club, featuring bluegrass and country music. But few country musicians or those who listened to it were willing to venture into the outcast Bowery neighborhood in which the club was located.
It was like the Wild West down here. Yeah. The cops they just forgot about us. You know, buildings are burning east of us, and the fire department didn't even come. They weren't picking up the trash.
We saw bums defecating in the street and then wiping themselves with their hands. I mean, just people just being insane. New York City was completely bankrupt at the time. And what it did is we started having fun with no money at all.
You could work a part-time job a couple of days a week and still afford your apartment, which was $100 a month back then, and then have time to work on your music or just hang out.
The cheap housing that Lower Manhattan offered was attracting young musicians and artists eager to develop a voice of their own. Hilly's floundering bar caught their attention. The first of those new groups to play there was Television, who in turn suggested it to their friends, the Ramones.
We spoke to Television, and we got a job one of the nights, you know, at CBGB. It's just a little dumpy little bar in the Bowery. No one going to it. We played our show, first show, and I think there was 2 people in the audience.
Well, they really didn't have it together. Their equipment would break down. They were yelling and screaming at each other on stage. There was more yelling and screaming on stage than playing, you know.
We were used to playing shows, and everyone just sat there and not knowing how to react, you know. Reactions got crazy as time went on.
Although it seemed like a flop at first, Hilly decided to stick with it.
This was something new. And it was not any of like the rock I heard, which is very complex and kind of long solos. This was kind of aggressive music. They were saying things that were personal to them, and I loved it.
Everybody was desperate to find a place to play. And so CB's became the place, sort of the welcoming, open arms to anybody.
As word of a new music scene spread through the downtown community, CBGB became the place to be.
It was a hang here. I mean, we would come here no matter who was playing, because it was like a clubhouse.
Everybody came here every night. Seriously. We would just, you know, what are you going to do tonight? You know, I'm going to CB's.
Hilly said, okay, things are happening. He realized the acoustics in here were perfect, and he didn't want to ruin that. So he didn't put up any kind of decor. He didn't change a thing.
It was grotty. It was grungy, and it was perfect.
Hilly had dogs. He had these Weimaraners, were they? 1 or 2 dogs like wandering around here, you know, and you know, you'd be walking up and down, you'd step on dog duty.
And he used to go right through the crowds, and Patti Smith would be on stage, and he'd go right up on stage, and go round and round and round, and go plump right down there.
But it was always just really disgusting, you know, the bathroom, the ladies' room was just like unbelievable, you know.
Bathroom was then down the stairs, never went down there ever. It looked so disgusting to me that I would never dream of going down to the bathroom. I'd just go in the back alley. This is the dump, it was disgusting.
Disgusting or not, the vibrant punk scene at CBGB finally received national attention in 1975. Though they were attracting a new crowd, the band still had a special bond.
There was a certain definite camaraderie, and everybody definitely knew each other.
I know we were super competitive towards everyone and snobs.
Johnny Ramone was very tolerant of us. I don't think he really liked us.
The Heartbreakers was the only other band that I looked upon as these guys are really good, but they're a bunch of junkies, so I don't have to worry about them. Their careers are going to be short.
Eventually, record companies swooped down on CBGBs to whisk away the top acts and bring them to larger venues with presumably better bathrooms. Although the excitement of the punk scene peaked by the 80s, CBGB has never stopped presenting new bands and original music.
It's not really changed much since about 1978. All the neon lights are the same. The graffiti just keeps getting thicker and thicker.
If you wonder what it was like back then, you can look around and certainly get a visceral feeling for it. Mm-hmm. And I guess that bands who come here to play are hoping some of that magic rubs off on them.
So go hear the cutting-edge music and check out the exclusive rock memorabilia. And if Hilly Kristal is there, you might want to ask him what CBGB OMFUG really stands for.
Country, bluegrass, blues, and other music for uplifting gourmandizers.
What exactly is a gourmandizer? According to Hilly, it's anyone with a voracious appetite for music. Next, we head to LA's Sunset Strip, where I'll tell you about the night the Doors got fired from the Whisky A Go Go. He says, "Father, I want to kill you." And I thought, oh my God, Jim, don't do it. No, please don't do it.
We're back with Travel Channel Presents.
Hollywood's Sunset Strip has always been LA's center for nightlife and trendsetters. And for the past 40 years, the cornerstone of that scene has been the Whisky A Go Go.
Whiskey's world famous. It's always going to be there. You know, it's always like, it's like a beacon.
You see the people hanging out outside, and you kind of hear those sounds coming from inside, and you just, you know, you got to stop.
The Whiskey, man, you think about Slayer, you think about Metallica, you think about the Doors, Jimi Hendrix, Led Zeppelin, you think about everybody in the scene, man.
You still feel the ghosts. You feel a lot of the ghosts around, which I like, you know. I think the vibes are still here. Thank you.
This is the world-famous Whisky A Go Go on the Sunset Strip in Los Angeles, California. A lot's changed, but the music is still here. Unfortunately, the Go-Go Girls are gone. Those cages that they danced in. The Doors were the house band, summer of 1966. Jim Morrison had a good time with the Go-Go Girls. They liked him a lot. The Booths are gone. Psychedelic is gone. The Sunset Strip was psychedelic in the summer of 1966. But before that, it was the era of rock and roll meets Hollywood.
And here's the world-famous Whisky A Go Go on the Strip, a favorite dancing spot for both the mods and movie stars who want to get it on.
Everybody who was anybody came into the Whisky and partied in those days.
Peter Fonda and Sal Mineo and Sean Connery and all these actors that would hang around.
I mean, you would go there to be seen and to see people.
There's an amazing convergence of attitudes and people. And it was just a wild scene.
The Whisky A Go Go opened in January of 1964 as America's first discotheque. Female DJs played records in a booth suspended high over the dance floor. Their elevated gyrations earned them the name Go-Go Girls. Live music was provided by a young R&B cover artist named Johnny Rivers. He played rock and roll and blues songs to a dancing, drinking-age crowd. Nothing like this had ever been seen on the Sunset Strip.
Johnny Rivers at the Whisky A Go Go was a big deal. Then they started having record success. Johnny Rivers live at the Whisky A Go Go. That did not hurt their club. More Johnny Rivers at the Whisky A Go Go. I mean, you know, forget about it. Everything they put out was a smash. Then it wasn't too difficult because everybody wanted to play there.
But while Johnny Rivers was entertaining the Hollywood hipsters, a whole new music scene was developing on the streets of L.A. as young folk musicians were rethinking their musical direction.
And that happened when the Beatles came and played Ed Sullivan. And all the groups said, hey, that's it, we're getting amps, we're getting electric guitars. You know, forget this acoustic stuff.
When we got together as the Byrds, we went to see A Hard Day's Night as a reconnaissance mission. And we checked out all Ludwig drums, okay, check, you know, Gretsch guitar, check. And then there's this weird guitar that looks like a 6-string, but then George Harrison turned sideways and it had 6 other pegs sticking out the back. And it was a 12. And I went, I played 12. I went, I gotta get one of those. So we did. We got an electric Rickenbacker 12-string, and that was what made the sound. They called it the jingle jangle sound after that.
The Byrds were the first of the new LA bands to play at the Whisky. The Sunset Strip turned from hipster to hippie almost overnight. Young LA bands like the Buffalo Springfield, Frank Zappa's Mothers of Invention, and my own band, The Doors, all got nightly exposure there, opening for national headliners. What made the Whisky A Go-Go such an important temple of rock was its role as a launching pad for all this new talent. Soon, young bands from around the country were clamoring to play its magical stage.
We became, you know, the house band on Monday and Tuesdays, and then we'd open for headliners during the week and on the weekends.
Rock royalty would also come to the Whisky to check out the new talent playing there.
All of a sudden I'm putting my horn away, it's a tap on my shoulder, and I turn around and it's Jimi Hendrix, and he looks at me, and I thought he was going to turn me invisible and go, and then I'd become going, like that, and he said, hey, you know what, I'd love to take you guys on the road as my opening act. I thought to myself, yeah, sure, right, or whatever. So the next thing I know is we're on the road opening up for Jimi Hendrix in every basketball arena in the country, and all we knew was basically bars.
It's easy to forget that the classic acts we know today weren't always famous. The legacy of the Whisky A Go-Go is that it gave future superstars a stage to develop their signature sound in front of a live audience. The best example of that might be my own experience with The Doors. When we played what turned out to be our last gig at LA's famous Temple of Rock.
It was a Thursday night, first set. Very few people in the club. Late summer of 1966. Jim misses the first set. John and Robbie and I go on stage and do some blues, a little jazz stuff. And at the end of the set, Phil Tanzini, one of the owners of the Whisky, comes up to us and says, hey, I booked 4 guys. The Doors are supposed to be 4 guys. Says, you better have Morrison here for that second set, or you guys are going to be in big trouble. John and Robbie and I just jump in John's VW bus and we go find Morrison, and he's at the Tropicana Hotel where he kept a room, and guess what? He's stoned on LSD. We bring him back to the Whisky in time for the second set, and everything's going good. The club is filled with people. The people are dancing. Second or third song into the set, Morrison says, let's do the end. I said, oh, Jim, it's like we do the end of the set. It's called the end. He said, no, man, I want to do the end. So we start the end, and the people just love it. And girls are doing that kind of hand dancing that they did. We're going along, and then the song gets soft in the middle of it, and Jim does an improvisation for the first time. A part John and Robbie and I had never heard before, coming out of some strange acid state. But John and Robbie and I are following him, and Jim starts to say, the killer awoke before dawn. He put his boots on.
He put his boots on. He took a face from the ancient gallery and he
walked on down the hallway, baby. The Whisky A Go-Go is being hypnotized by the delivery of Jim Morrison. The waitresses stop serving, the dancers stop dancing, even the go-go girls in their cages, and they're paid to dance. They even stop dancing. And then Jim finally gets to the end of that improvisation and he says, Father?
Yes, son, I want to kill you.
I thought, oh my God, Jim, don't do it. No, please don't do it. He's going to do Oedipus Rex. And sure enough, Jim says, Mother, I want to, and he shouts out the F word with all the gusto he possibly can. John and Robbie and I assault our instruments, and the frozen Whiskey A Go-Go comes back to life. We play the set, and we get off the stage, and people are just mesmerized, screaming, loving the whole thing, except for Phil Tanzini, who rushes upstairs and says to us, "You, Morrison, are the filthiest guy on this planet. You can't say that about your mother. Not on the stage of the Whiskey A Go-Go. You're fired." Wisely, Robbie says to him, "Phil, it's a Thursday night. You want us to play the weekend, or are we fired right now?" And Phil says, oh yeah. You know, you play the weekend, you're fired on Sunday. And that was it for the Whiskey A Go-Go.
This is the end.
When we return, more behind-the-scenes stories of the Whiskey from the man they call the Pope of the Sunset Strip.
One time, Keith Moon from The Who, come on stage, took all his clothes off, stark naked. I said, "What are you doing? Are you crazy?"
We're back with Travel Channel Presents.
Hi, I'm Ray Manzarek of The Doors. Welcome back to the Temples of Rock.
The Whiskey A Go-Go was key to the development of the Los Angeles music scene. But where did the idea come from, and who were the men who started it?
Two guys, cops in Chicago. Names are Mario Maglieri and Elmer Valentine.
The fella that got the name Whiskey A Go-Go was Elmer Valentine, which used to be a partner here, and he started this whiskey in 1964.
So they go to Paris, France, and they see this club there, the Whiskey A Go-Go, with girls in cages dancing, and they say, "This is what we should do in L.A."
Elmer was in France at the time, and he got this idea in Paris, in France, and he brought it back here. And that's how the Go-Go girls got started in the cages here.
Mario sort of became the dominant businessman over the years. He's a tough MF with a heart of gold.
I talk to some of these rapper groups, I said, "Why do you want to be a mean guy? Why do you want to be like that? You know, you fight that guy over there, you know what's going to happen? You're not going to win, he's not going to win, you're both going to jail. So why do you want to do it?" And you just keep preaching. I feel like a priest sometimes.
If the Whiskey A Go-Go is LA's sacred temple of rock, then Mario Maglieri is certainly its high priest.
Had one guy, Jack Sidney, poor guy died. I mean, he was drugged out. He wanted to write a book about the Pope of Sunset Strip. I was supposed to be the Pope. That's so many stories. I've got so many stories that I've got. It's not even funny.
The story behind the whiskey is the rare tale of overnight success. It came on the scene when music and pop culture seemed to dominate everything else. The world was definitely ready to go a go-go.
We had line up around a block waiting to get in at night. We had all kind of stars and actors used to frequent this place here. God, I remember Ava Gardner in the middle booth, and one of the partners here, Phil, he says, "Who's that broad in that booth?" I said, "It's Ava Gardner." Yeah, tell her to get out of my booth. Hey, that was his table, period. He don't care who you were. He's a great guy, Phil. He died on me,
For most musicians, the goal really wasn't to play arenas and ride around in limousines and have drug problems. Well, maybe have drug problems, but the goal was to play the whiskey, you know. That was the goal. Man, you know, we got a record out. We're doing a weekend at the Whiskey, man. You know, we got a Friday and Saturday night. That's when you knew you made it.
Sometimes making it at the Whiskey proved to be too much to handle.
You know how many times I talked to Jim Morrison? I used to grab him and shake him. "Why are you doing this to yourself?" And all he do is stone, booze, and drug. "Oh, Mario, I love you." That's all I got out of him. But he's a good kid, good entertainer, but he OD'd, went down the drain. You know, I can go on with stories. Janis Joplin was a few days before she OD'd. And she'd always say, "A girl would bring her Southern Comfort on the rocks." That's what she drank. And in that raspy voice of hers, she'd say, "I don't want that drink. I want the whole bottle." And she got the whole bottle. And she drank that like crazy. Then I had my kid put a whole case in her car before she left. I didn't want to run out of booze. Led Zeppelin, John Bonham, Robert Plant, Jimmy Page. You ever saw people party, they know what partying was about. Hell, I remember one time Keith Moon from The Who come on stage, took all his clothes off, stark naked. I said, what are you doing? Are you crazy? Oh, don't hit me. I said, I'm not going to hit you. Get off the stage and put some clothes on.
The Whisky A Go-Go has seen some turbulent times, but one of the most volatile periods was when a new sound called punk came rolling down the Sunset Strip. The music's violent edge prompted Mario to pull the plug.
We closed here for quite some time because of punks like Sid Vicious, people like that. It isn't that they were bad, they were destructive. You walk out of the club, they break car windows, and they just ruin the neighborhood. Close the door. Close them, I don't want them.
They closed the Whisky down, you know, and that pretty much did it, you know, because the focal point was gone. You know, there wasn't a place to aspire to anymore.
The Whisky opened to live music again in the early 80s with a heavier metal sound filling its stage. Visit the Whisky A Go-Go today and you'll find up-and-coming talent hoping to follow in the footsteps of its more famous alumni.
When you think back, hey, the groups that used to play there, they were up and coming too. The fact that they're famous now, the Doors, the Buffalo Springfield, the Byrds, you know, they weren't that well known back then, so maybe nothing's changed, you know.
As long as there are bands seeking success, Mario is willing to help them reach their dreams.
I think it gives a lot of young people opportunities. That's the best thing about the Whisky. Young people. I'm going to do the same thing I'm doing here till the day I die. Rock and roll.
Next, we take a trip to San Francisco's psychedelic temple of rock, the Fillmore Auditorium.
Everybody was just blown away how many people there were who were just like us. Colorful and crazy and ready for anything.
We're back with Travel Channel Presents
Jefferson Airplane, The Grateful Dead, Big Brother and the Holding Company. All these bands emerged from the social experiment that came to be called the San Francisco Sound. The key ingredients? Loud music, long hair, peace, love, and a little bit of LSD.
LSD stands for lysergic acid diethylamide. It is very dangerous in that its effect can be different each time it is taken.
One pill makes you larger, and one pill makes you small, and the ones that mother gives you don't do anything at all.
The Fillmore Auditorium was the center of all things psychedelic in San Francisco in the late 60s. In its heyday, it was filled with dancers immersed in an environment of light and sound. The man behind the Fillmore was a German immigrant named Bill Graham. He, more than any other person, was responsible for the impact of the San Francisco ballroom scene and the acid rock sound that was born there. While those experimental days are long gone, the Fillmore in San Francisco is open once again, inviting a new audience to experience its history.
Yeah, you see all the posters on the walls of Janis Joplin and Jimmy.
Grateful Dead played here, Fish, some other big bands in the past.
But the classic concerts presented at the Fillmore are only one part of its legacy. It was also a center of the cultural revolution taking place in the mid-60s. A revolution that grew out of the spirit of San Francisco itself. There, the notions of exploration, introspection, and improvisation were explored. Concepts nurtured on the streets of San Francisco.
I think San Francisco has always been a city that's fostered kind of creative urges and different things, craziness, that they've tolerated that.
It's really not surprising that some kind of cultural renaissance would take place in San Francisco. I think that the Beats obviously were a large part of it, a very literary movement, the Beats. But also it was the lifestyle, you know, which appealed a lot to us lazy California kids.
The bohemian lifestyle of the Beats was supercharged by the excitement of early 60s rock and roll. From the unlikeliest of sources, the final ingredient was added to complete this formula for cultural change.
LSD was introduced to the greater United States in a program called MK Ultra, where combined forces of the CIA and Army intelligence tested it, thinking it was going to be a weapon.
LSD was legal for much of the early 60s, if you remember this sort of thing. And people took full advantage of that situation and learned a lot doing it, and learned a lot of searching and passion and joy and just intellectual curiosity from the process. And then they made it illegal, and that just made it more fun as far as we were concerned.
Suddenly, the old inhibitions disappeared and a new youth culture was uniting under the California sun.
There was a quest going on. Everybody was moving together.
It was ritual. It was total ritual. You know, it was like going back 10, 20,000 BC.
Nudity and sensuality and all those things was part of the mix.
This is all the Greek-Roman revelries, only with a high-powered lightning bolt groove.
The Fillmore Auditorium was the common link in bringing together the various people and events that would be instrumental in developing the new San Francisco sound. Bill Graham's first introduction to the Fillmore was as manager of the San Francisco mime troupe. He often found himself having to devise new ways of raising money for their legal defense.
Bill Graham throws a benefit for the mime troupe here at the Fillmore Auditorium. The police are trying to shut it down because it's a flagrant violation of every law known to God, man, and the fire marshal. And Bill Graham earns his spurs on day one of his showbiz career by saying, listen, Frank, as in Frank Sinatra, Frank's flying in from Vegas to do a turn. You can't cut us down now.
Although Frank Sinatra was never coming, the benefit attracted many more people than expected. The experience proved that Bill Graham had what it took to be a concert promoter.
We would go past the curfew hours and police, he would talk the police out of shutting us down, and the bands would be on acid and drugs, and the audience too, and we have apple barrels out there and punch, and they'd all be spiked. This would go on, and people didn't want to leave, and everybody was involved with this massive orgy of music and creativity happening, and Graham would keep it going. He would keep the doors open till dawn. He would serve breakfast.
About this time, another thread comes into the warp and the woof of the weave of San Francisco cultural politics. There's a man named Ken Kesey. He wrote the very great novel, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. He has more money than he knows what to do with. He decides to spend that money throwing parties in which people will come together, take LSD, and see what happens. That's called the acid tests.
To provide music for the multimedia acid tests, Kesey hired a young Palo Alto group who had just changed their names from the Warlocks to the Grateful Dead.
We played 3 or 4 acid tests, and the big acid test that we played ended up right here at the Fillmore. We brought in all the crazies, if you will, all the freaks from San Francisco who were just like us, colorful and crazy and ready for anything.
The acid tests culminated in a 3-day event called the Trips Festival. Bill Graham, who had been hired to manage the festival, decided it was time to present these happenings as a controlled concert experience. Within a month of the Trips Festival, Graham outmaneuvered all competition to exclusively present weekly concerts at the Fillmore Auditorium. When we come back, we'll see and hear what it was like to be inside San Francisco's psychedelic Temple of Rock.
People were just on the ground screwing everywhere. They were just making love.
We're back with Travel Channel Presents.
The Fillmore in San Francisco is a classic venue, continuing to present music in the tradition started by rock impresario Bill Graham. But back in the 60s, it was more than just concerts happening at the Fillmore. It was a whole new way of experiencing music.
It was a dance hall. People danced. They did not sit down. They were not passive audience people. They were participants.
In spite of the psychedelics happening at the Fillmore, It was the simple act of dancing that threatened to shut it down.
You had to have a dance permit to hold a dance in San Francisco before about 1966.
There had been a lot of controversy about Bill having the dance permit at the Fillmore. The local police didn't want him to have it.
It was frowned upon. People weren't supposed to dance. People were supposed to sit down and enjoy music. Bill Graham went to the city council and dealt with them. Of course, when he was doing it so he'd make money, that's great. Because without that, it wouldn't have happened.
With the dance floors open, ballrooms began to flourish in the Bay Area. But the Fillmore was always the place to be.
The thing about the Fillmore is that people came to the Fillmore to come to the Fillmore, not really knowing necessarily what to expect, and it didn't really matter.
It all came out of the Grateful Dead's experience in the acid test, in which they weren't the show.
There was many times the fact that the audience was much more interesting than what was on stage. Grace always used to characterize the stage as just a good place at the party because it was a little less crowded and you could see everything.
It wasn't a question of the audience coming to worship us. It was that the totality of the organism, the group mind that we evolved between the audience and the band, that is worshiping the higher realms and being allowed to bring down the heavenly music.
Bill Graham presented this music at the Fillmore Auditorium using the best sound system available. He also was the first to introduce monitoring speakers on stage for the bands. He oversaw every detail, ensuring the best possible experience for both audience and performers.
All the bands use the Fillmore as sort of like a home base. So we played really passionately here. It was like nowhere else.
We'd have shows, you know, the Dead, us, Quicksilver, all on the same bill. I mean, it was, then they'd all get together at the end and play together, you know, when we go on into the morning hours sometimes, you know, like 4 or 5 bass players, 6 guitar players, 3 drummers, all on stage just jamming. Guys singing, making up lyrics. That was fantastic.
Improvisation was the legacy of the San Francisco sound. Bands rode the beast that lived in the center of a song, and no band did it better than the Grateful Dead.
You remember a band when you used to rehearse and do everything really right? That was the old band. This is not that band. This band is chaos. It's like a wild animal just out of the cage. You don't know if it's going to rip you apart or not, and then you just try to get it back in the cage at the end of the night. You know, and that's a good night.
The jamming atmosphere at the Fillmore influenced the music of visiting bands as well.
The Fillmore was by far the best place that we had ever played. We just started off doing our little sort of 3, 4, 5 minute songs, and then the audience was shouting kind of, just play. So we just started playing and extending our sort of solos. And they loved it, and we loved it. Of course, we had the wonderful light shows that were going on at that time, which we loved because none of us were really front men. You know, we liked to just become part of this large thing. It was really great.
The all-encompassing light show was a major part of the Fillmore experience, engulfing both the audience and the performers.
It's like bathing in light. That's what it is. All these different colors and forms washing over you all the time.
And there was no real lights, no spots or anything on the stage. And people were just on the ground screwing everywhere. You know, I mean, they were just making love. And it was not uncommon to see people. They would like to do it over here in the strobes.
The light shows used a variety of projection techniques, pioneered by light artists such as Bill Ham, who remarkably still practices his craft today.
The thing that's called the first rock and roll light show was actually a kinetic piece that I made to be at the Red Dog Saloon, which was the first gig any band in town had had. So I've continued doing light shows all this time. And for me, it's a form of painting.
What's that you're putting in? What's that first spray?
No, I don't tell secrets.
Okay. This family recipe.
I don't tell secrets. We took an old empty room with no stage lighting and with a few classroom overhead projectors, created a whole new world.
The posters advertising the Fillmore shows were a new art form as well. They graphically captured the Fillmore experience and in the process documented Bill Graham's knack for diversifying his shows by including top jazz, blues, and R&B acts.
We saw Otis Redding and Count Basie here. Count Basie. I was sitting on the floor when Basie's horn section kicked in. And after the first 16 bars, I was back about 6 feet, you know?
But playing the Fillmore Auditorium, the people that actually ran it kept it in the dark. You had to almost get a flashlight to put your makeup on. And it was such an atmosphere. But when it filled up, it was filled up with people who really appreciated the music. And being in the dark that way had a sort of a mysterious and sort of a magic a tone to it.
The magic of the Fillmore Auditorium would come to an end in the summer of 1968, when Bill Graham moved his operation to a larger venue he called the Fillmore West. But that, as they say, is another story. For those who lived firsthand from what would be called the Summer of Love, it's very difficult to accurately describe what that experience was like.
And it's such a cliche now. People look at, you know, some old footage and they go, you know, it looks so hokey. And all I can say is, there are some things on this planet you had to be there, and if you weren't, you have my sincere sympathy.
So if you're going to San Francisco, be sure to take a walk down Haight Street, and you'll find that the spirit of the 60s is still very much alive. And if you take a ride to the corner of Fillmore and Geary, you'll find that the Fillmore is presenting new shows, still carrying on some of the old customs.
They give you free apples, which is always good.
A lot of people out front here in the Fillmore, so figured I'd check it out. You know, it's got some good history here. It's been a lot of big bands that have played here in the past.
It's a classic rock hall, man. Everybody knows about it. Everybody plays here. Everybody wants to go see shows here.
The shows at the Fillmore Auditorium were legendary, not only for presenting classic rock music, but also for nurturing the spirit of a generation.
The idea of this celebrating the spirit I think is why the 60s is so popular now with all of us, because we're seeing that new spirit come out, and God knows we need it.
Next, we'll visit Detroit and find out where and how the classic Motown hits were made.
There were people standing here in the door until they closed it, waiting to say, if she can't sing it, we can.
We're back with Travel Channel Presents.
Hi, I'm Ray Manzarek of The Doors. Welcome back to the Temples of Rock.
We'd like you to meet the man that was responsible for getting the whole Motown story started, president of the Motown Record Corporation, Mr. Berry Gordy. Hi, old buddy. We were at Motown the other day, Barry, as you know, and we had a wonderful time. We'd like to roll that film right now for you and Barney and everybody in Teen Town to show you where Hitsville is, where the whole Motown story gets going each and every day.
Whoever built the small white house at 2648 West Grand Boulevard in Detroit could never have imagined that some of the greatest songs of all time would be recorded inside its walls. Though it's no longer an active recording studio, it remains open as the Motown Museum, inviting music fans to come and see where Motown magic was made.
It's just a house. It's just a little tiny house. But it was filled with music, and all that wonderful music that you've heard over the years came from this very room.
Records were earth-shattering. We used to call them window jumpers. They'd make you want to jump out the window.
Many times people ask me, and they say, Smokey, why was there so much talent in Detroit at that time? Well, my answer to that is, there are talented people in every little city, every little town, every village in the world. There's a bunch of talented people there. The difference was in Detroit, we had Berry Gordy.
Berry Gordy Jr. was the founder and driving force behind the Motown legend. He was a Detroit native who had established himself as an R&B songwriter. But he was tired of being ripped off by the established music business. So in 1959, he decided to start his own record label. And with an $800 loan, he and his wife set out to find a place his music could call home.
He bought a building on West Grand Boulevard, which was actually a house with a garage attached. And he and Ray lived in the upstairs part of the house. The downstairs became the offices. The kitchen was torn out and it became the control room. And we put a big glass and the garage became the recording studio.
Modestly, he called his new studio Hitsville, USA. Motown's Hitsville studio attracted the best young talent Detroit had to offer, and Berry Gordy turned that raw talent into some of the most famous soul acts in the world. He became the patriarch to a growing family of singers, songwriters, and producers.
At Motown in the early days, we were like a family. We were like a big family making music.
Gordy also recruited the best Detroit musicians he could find, giving his recordings a distinctive sound.
An amazing house band, and they had a definitive sound. They helped invent new ways of playing music that would strengthen the beat.
They were like an entity unto themselves, the Funk Brothers we called them.
And a lot of people did not know how our music had the pulsation to it, which was very effective. You listen to it today. That's the reason it spans time, because your heart's beating like this, and so is that funk beating like that. The Funk Brothers and your heart are one.
The talent at Hitsville was unsurpassed, and so was the sound of its small studio. In the 60s, Motown charted an unprecedented 80 top 10 hits. Almost all of them were recorded here. The busy studio was nicknamed the Snake Pit, and its close quarters undeniably contributed to the unique Motown sound.
As many as 50 pieces have been in this room. The cords you see hanging overhead would have mics on them, and we'd stand in different positions and we'd sing.
Remember the time we had the rhythm on one side? The horns be sitting right there. Yeah. The horns blasting and everything. Wasn't even talking about separation. There was no separation. The attitude. We went from a hit record to a stew. Okay? Because it was all mixed up together. The potatoes, the gravy, the meat, and the peas, everything in one pot. Everybody said, boy, that Motown sound is great. Yeah, you got a stew pot, you get it too.
People always say, well, what is the Motown sound? The Motown sound was this. They had more drums. No, they had a little more kick drum than everybody else. No, it was the backbeat was there. No. It was the bass that came out like that. No, the Motown sound was the people.
When you walk down the hall and you see Stevie standing over here talking to somebody, Four Tops over there, the Supremes over here, go downstairs in the studio and you see the Marvelettes, all in one day, all in one company, that's unusual. Yeah.
Hitsville was like our hanging place. Everybody loved being there.
It should be remembered that in the early 60s, America was racially divided, but Gordy was determined to break the color barrier. He developed an assembly line operation geared at crossing over to the white audience.
The whole genius of his concept was the all-inclusive package. You know, I'm going to teach you how to dance, I'm going to teach you what to wear, I'm going to teach you how to move on stage, I'm going to teach you how to act off stage. You know, we're going to have great songwriters write you the songs.
We actually had a school, and it was called Artist Development. You had to attend. It was mandatory. I don't care who you were. We had music theory classes, we had choreography, we had personal development, and if we weren't doing that, then we'd be in here recording.
The greater the record success, however, the greater competition it brought amongst the Motown family.
There were people standing here in the door until they closed it, waiting to say, if she can't sing it, we can.
By the early 70s, there was unrest in the Motown empire. Berry Gordy's obvious favoritism of the Supremes and their lead singer Diana Ross upset several of the Motown artists. But Berry had Hollywood dreams to fulfill, and he was prepared to leave many of his old Motown faithful behind.
This was a time where I had slowed down to have my son and was ready to call Motown and find out my next assignment. And I was told that Motown had moved to Los Angeles. And that she put it this way, she said, "Girl, didn't you know that Motown moved?" And here I was with a child, and I had to go on. It's quite a shock.
It scared everybody, you know. Losing homes, selling cars. And you didn't know what was going to happen. You didn't know what you were going to do because that was so sudden. You know, it just up and happened.
And it was my understanding that Berry moved because, number one, he had outgrown Detroit and this operation. Number two, he wanted to make movies. And number three, he wanted to feature Diana Ross in those movies.
While Gordy and his advisors were sure they could develop new talent in L.A., they had reservations about leaving the Hitsville studio behind.
They were so confident with the quality and the sound that was produced out of this room that they actually gave some serious thought to breaking this room down and putting it in wooden crates and moving it to California just to reproduce this room, because they had so much faith in the sound of this room.
Maybe that's why they left us behind.
Yeah, that's right.
They want to take the damn studio and can us. That's strange, isn't it?
Yeah. In Los Angeles, Motown Records would never again regain the magic it had in Detroit. And although it escaped the chainsaw, the home that had produced so many hits remained silent for almost 10 years. But in 1980, Berry Gordy's sister decided that it was time to open it to the public as a historical museum and let them relive the memories.
Esther Gordy Edwards was one of probably the only executives that opted not to move to California in '72, and she discovered that people continued to return to this place just to take a look at it. They kind of wanted to kiss the ground, come into Studio A and see where everything took place, and after a while she realized that she had a real gem.
Today, the Motown Museum keeps its memories and artifacts on display, inviting guests from all over the world to tour its halls. And making a pilgrimage there could yield more than just a few souvenirs. You might just meet some of the old Motown stars as well.
You never know who's going to come through that front door. So it could be me or you, or it could be Martha Reeves, it could be Stevie Wonder, it could be Gladys Knight. You just never know, so you always have to be prepared.
The fact that you can still walk through here, there's a magic, there's a feeling. I always get it when I come, so I know it's true and it's real of the success of Motown.
When we return, we'll uncover the legacy of New York's lost Temple of Rock.
We're back with Travel Channel Presents.
Seeking to expand upon his success in San Francisco, rock impresario Bill Graham decided to bring the Fillmore experience to the East Coast. But it was more than just a simple transplant. With grand New York style, he opened a theater that was arguably the greatest rock venue of all time. Great sound, great lights, great music. And anyone who ever attended a show there would never forget it.
I saw The Who there, and I saw The Doors there. I went to Mountain, played there for a week of Christmas, and I went about 4 times to see Mountain.
It was the first place that people probably discovered Joni Mitchell, Laura Nyro, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young.
Some of the best shows we ever did were at the Fillmore East in New York City.
A venue is like a picture frame. Like the Fillmore East was a beautiful frame. It was a nice old theater. A good frame is really important to a painting. The same is true with an artist on stage. The Fillmore was a great frame.
Bill Graham opened the Fillmore East in 1968. Unlike the ballroom setting of the Fillmore in San Francisco, he chose an ornate old movie theater as his East Coast venue. While it was open, its marquee would read like a who's who of 60s-era rock music. Unfortunately, it's a temple that no longer stands. Like the ruins of a vanquished empire, only its upper facade remains. Today, people pass unknowingly through what was once the entrance to a grand temple of rock.
Where I'm standing now is
2nd Avenue and 6th Street. It's the most famous corner in the history of New York rock and roll. The audience would line up down the street here, down 6th Street, and they come into the Fillmore East, which was over here, and that's where the Fillmore East actually was. The famous marquee came out, and people would enter through there. Next door to the Fillmore is this very important place. I have my hand on what was the Tisch School of the Arts in 1968, filled with very bright people who had studied theater and were going to go into theater and had all the theater skills. Now I have my hand on what was to become the Fillmore East. And these two buildings share a common wall that goes all the way halfway to 3rd Avenue. It's amazing. And what happened was that as this scene began to develop, very quickly word got over here. It only had to travel 6 inches. And it got over here, and the young graduate students and people who were here started to come over here after class. And after a while, they didn't go back. And so the reason the Fillmore was such a powerful performance space is because everybody working here was trained in the theater.
New York, Bill Graham and his staff presented rock music with a quality and formality that was unheard of at the time. There were 2 shows nightly, complete with uniformed ushers, playbills, and intermissions. Even the use of a light show, a mainstay of his West Coast venue, was transformed to fit the theatrical proscenium setting.
In New York, it was a theater with reserved seats. Completely different discipline because people can't wander away. They're forced to look straight ahead. So we took the responsibility for their eyeballs from the moment they arrived until the moment they closed the house. We'd show cartoons, we'd have funny slides. And when the band was introduced, their name came up, and the first note of music there was a visual, and the second note of music there was a different visual, and then we would listen and make things happen.
It just made for an amazing presentation of rock and roll, and that's what Bill Graham wanted. He wanted to show rock and roll at its highest level. Not only the music, but the visual presentation and the efficiency of not having to wait for an hour between bands. It was just great rock and roll theater.
The shows at the Fillmore East usually featured 3 acts on every bill. Bill Graham would do his best to make every evening a unique entertainment experience.
He loved to play with the billing. Like to have like Led Zeppelin, Woody Herman, and Richie Havens.
Blue Cheer with the Soul Survivors and Sly and the Family Stone. It would just be these crazy bills.
He loved to do that. Just have the most bizarre bills he could come up with. But not for their bizarreness, but to educate the audience.
And that educated New York audience soon became known as one of the most demanding in rock and roll.
You were more under a microscope when you worked at the Fillmore East.
Just seemed like New York expected more and knew more about what you were doing. Whether they did or not, that was the aura of that city.
Even though you didn't know, these thousands of other people sitting next to you were sitting around you, you kind of felt spiritually like you knew them, and you felt like you were a group of kindred spirits.
More often than not, the bands would live up to the expectations of the Fillmore crowd. Its magical atmosphere would encourage musicians to reach new heights.
The thing about the Fillmore East was we could play all night. There was no curfews on the East Coast. In most other halls, there was always curfews.
Yeah, it was great at the Fillmore East because you could play until noon if you wanted to. You know, we damn near did a couple of times.
The Fillmore East would soon develop a mystique that would attract the attention of those outside the rock world.
Leonard Bernstein came to the Fillmore to see a concert, and he was being given a tour backstage, and he was shown the Joshua Light Show. We were hanging off the back wall, and he wanted to try running a liquid projection plate. So we set him up and said, "Ready, maestro?" And he said yes, and I turned it on, and he proceeded to perform, and he had a great time.
The backstage was a nut house. I mean, I remember Frank Zappa, rest in peace, on the stairs with 2 young ladies. And what was going on, I really can't repeat, but
talking
I mean, I was on
and
my
fondling
way to my trombone to warm up, and I just...
Amidst all the music and hijinks, Bill Graham was busy building a rock and roll empire, and his notorious temper kept people from getting in his way.
I remember sitting out in the outer office, and I heard Bill on the phone, and he was screaming at somebody on the telephone, and I heard him say something to the effect of, well, that's it, you're off of my Christmas list, and slamming down the phone. And I kind of slid down in the seat and said, oh my God, I hope he doesn't come walking out of that office, because it was just this burst of fury.
Mike said no, but Mike said he didn't mind people coming in. You don't want no, okay. I don't want them in here. Okay. Well, it's very simple.
But after the national exposure of events like Woodstock in 1969, more and more rock acts became interested in the business side of music. Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young at the Fillmore East seemed to typify growing rock star demands.
Bill Graham would come and he would knock on the door and said, they're not leaving, you've got to come back and do some more. And we go, look, we've just done 3 hours, come on, give us a break, you know. So I think it was Crosby said, we want money. And Bill Graham starts to feed $100 bills under the door. And when he got to, I think, 8, Neil said, okay, we'll do one more song.
The change in the rock and roll scene made it difficult for the 2,600-seat theater to compete with the arena-sized audiences that top acts were now willing to play to. With the writing on the wall, Bill Graham decided to preemptively pull the plug on his Fillmore operations in the summer of 1971.
There's a part of me that thinks that Bill was just tired. And, you know, booking both coasts and running back and forth. And he may have needed a rest, and he may have needed to back off a little bit.
Sometimes I
Graham closed the Fillmore East with the same grand style that he opened it, booking a series of concerts with some of his favorite bands.
You know, there was that kind of sadness that it was the closing of the Fillmore, but at the same time, let's make it a night to remember.
The departure of the Fillmore East marked the end of an era for the New York rock scene. But if you go to the corner of 2nd Avenue and 6th Street today, you'll find that it's not been completely forgotten. And if you stand there and listen, perhaps you'll be able to feel the vibes of the grandest rock temple of them all.
In the movie The Field of Dreams, an apparition whispers, if you build it, they will come. Now, is that what happened to Sam Phillips, or Berry Gordy, or Bill Graham, or Hilly Kristal? Probably not. These men were visionaries who had an open ear for a new sound. They understood that it was time for a new direction in music, and they were willing and able to provide a place for that music to grow. Today, we might ask, are there any such visionaries out there in the current music business? And if so, in what ordinary places are they laying the groundwork for the future temples of rock?